we stand in the face of ongoing state center of tonight's event. It's a great, as with in fostering relations of care, restoration of a movement to abolish landscape of rebellion, builds upon recent histories in Ferguson, Baltimore, and earlier Watts. We're also deepening our awareness of the laws to learn from and the lift up as it is with dignified inheritance. Our hope here at Making Worlds that this event will be one in a series that in Philadelphia. Immigrants and grew up in equitable schools in her community to work towards social equity. She is in the shift in narrative. And we've got as program director with the Paul Robeson to invest in addressing survival needs and seeding abolitionists in Philly anthology, How We Stay Free. Please be on the lookout for that. Gio Meyer is the author of A World, and after this book, two, the Vassar College, San Quentin State Prison, and the Venezuelan School of Planning is a true dialectician. Okay, so each panelist will speak for 10 to the audience. So for our viewers on the live stream, we actually have set up a, so please jot your notes down in the chat and we'll be attending to that. There is a bathroom for those who haven't found it already behind our panelists. Just accept when you're here speaking. I wish I had thought of that before I started speaking myself. Gio. Okay. Please welcome our.
Hi. Good evening, everyone. Long admired. I really want to thank Mala Law Project, Law, Policy, Invest Resources into our community. So literally every time I'm this quote, because the Amistad print choice abolition with the animation by artist Eric, they're very beautiful. So abolition required, even if that's not actually true. We haven't always, analyses are the way that they've always been and always have to be. Neighbor Walter Wallace Jr. Amistad got together with an amazing group of social workers and nurses and instead make a life-affirming and life-saving interventions for people being successful models in other cities and reviewing best practices and just think how we could fully meet people's needs. And the first roadblock we encountered was the city of Philadelphia was just already just completely committed to continuing to use the failed and murderous system, and tasers. And the most insidious thing was that they wanted to pair custody and process, even after, like before the uprising last year, Department of Behavioral Health. What if we had a non-police response, like what Department of Behavioral Health over the past spring? We pushed infrastructure in Philadelphia for mobile crisis, but it's terrible. There's one unit of crisis response, expand their what they're responding to, and we could get the police calls. There will be escalation. There'll be increased likelihood of arrest and emergency services that folks in the future. And of course, there's racial trauma and increased crisis line that folks can call to reach that that mobile crisis unit. But it's and so we needed to make sure that when people call 911, they could. So we have that model, and we did win last budget season, working with Department of Behavioral Health and the city to actually make that implemented. The city is still just so deeply entrenched in this co-responder model, and they are further along in that our fight rollback. I know that folks were disappointed, didn't pass, but what organizers accomplished there was truly remarkable that they had never seen. It's just how entrenched of the past year, they had the basic, most smallest, and just talk about, why they felt to just one another. We really quickly is trying to not replicate the harmful systems, and systems have been hugely oppressive. So we are not looking effective and solve something better for our communities. So that's what I wanted to share.
Cities, Pennsylvania, down Walnut. My work is sort of centered nationally with Black Lives Matter at School, where we advocate, presently people I see in abolitionist community. All right, in June 2020, of George Floyd and watching, Minneapolis there was a petition, got about 12,000, a huge incident of violence, the rubber bullets that was spread through that residential neighborhood. It was not only to fill the amount of, beyond just the, PPD, so to speak, and what the PPD administrators that we're seeing, they do a grant program or, toxic infrastructures in schools rather than commit to the 250, like organizing undergraduate students, recognizing our relationship to other universities, community justice, Drexel for pilots. So there's this growth, our current sort of, it's on, we call it abolition, but I still pen, under et cetera, to this point. And we believe that this endorsement indicates that many of us at the University of Pennsylvania, that exist at the University of Pennsylvania, racial bias forms have not worked. It's critical that every one of us to engage and be accountable to the expansive relationships with the occupied Lenape land, now referred to as Philadelphia, no longer necessary, is that we take responsibility for our future. Black Philly, specific to Black life, and globally, we are well on our way to a just world. This also speaks to reaching towards solid the abolition and wider, urgent transnational calls for and threatening the status quo is necessary. We must reject the light concessions being offered, along with proposed and yearning for a new way. So I'm gonna try to do two things with my final minutes, right? And I wanna sort of say those words together and kind of get some interactivity, right? So the first one is decriminalize. Can we say that together? It's, campus and local activism. Recognizing that as we sort of continue to organize and mobilize, did y'all know Penn has this, but then you got the allied Barton who is exploiting Black labor and not providing livable wages or rights to collective stick to campus. We have to recognize that that's also a surveillance mechanism against the local West Philadelphia community. So how do we set the divest in all investments in policing and prison industries? So what we mean by this is we can't just look at the University of Pennsylvania police force. We also have to be looking at the ways that research that comes out of the university emboldens and reinforces, the policing and prison industrial complex. I'll give you an example of Richard Burke. Richard Burke is the sort of designer, the mastermind behind these sort of risk management algorithms, which determine sort of the ransom that is bail, the cash bail system, right? If you come out of this is a Penn research project that has now made its way and been bought by parole and police boards and prison boards all over the country and probably internationally as well. So we have to think about how that research supports that. Defund. Immediate transparency on UPP data and finances and a progressive down payment towards UPPD dissolution. One of the things we noticed that all those other police forces that are in Pennsylvania, what is their responsibilities to transparency, right? While we do have maybe an inroads, but not always do we get those things in terms of city politics. We have all these other sort of spaces that don't really have to provide public information on what their assets are, right? One of the things we learned is that Mo Rush, who at Penn to raise money to buy SWAT weapons for the sort of Philadelphia police, right? Well, at the same time, we don't even know what the University of Pennsylvania has in terms of their assets. What sort of equipment, cars, weapons, things do they have? So that transparency was necessary. Disband. Abolition of the UPPD and the realization of a police-free Penn. So the first thing we put in there is Mo Rush got to go. How can we say that we are foundation on salary? I don't get that, how that makes sense. Redress. We want the removal of all campus monuments to slavery and white supremacy. So the iconography around Penn's campus, and we could talk about that later. Reinvest. Transfer significant financial resources into community-controlled funds in West Philadelphia and beyond. One of the ways in which Penn sort of continues its sort of thing is they create these sort of public relations boards, right? Where it's the president of the sort of local community association. There's the local homeowner association, I should say. And then the nonprofit leads in an area. And then they sort of what do y'all need from us? How can we give you sort of certain money? And it comes so when we talk about building true community control, what does that look like? How do we build new assemblies of community to think about holding truth to power, holding powerful institutions accountable? And lastly, reimagine. Development of police-free strategies for community safety and well-being. especially for Black, Indigenous, POC, and LGBTQIA communities. So this was important that as we continue to organize, we think not just about, the disbanding of the police, but also about abolitionist presence, thinking about the types of community institutions that we want to build. And that's how we get to the mutual aid project that we're just beginning now, where we partner with the organizers of, the Freedom Side School Project, which is coming out of like CATB and the Human Rights Coalition, and thinking of how do we leverage the concentrated wealth that is in the University of Pennsylvania community, right, and see that in terms of building, an abolitionist elementary school. How do we talk about not only that from like a money standpoint, but also just from like a labor standpoint? How can we, as students, as people who are interested in building the abolitionist world, contribute our labor and our resources to see that come into being? So that's just a little bit about what we do at Police Free Penn, and I'm excited to be in conversation with everyone else.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for responding. I say that to my students all the time, and they just look at me. It's very sad. So it's really wonderful to see so many good comrades here, new faces here, and also to be sharing space with comrades. In fact, this is my second meeting with Chris today, and we organized together in Police Free Penn, among other spaces. I want to start out by sharing a bit of a confession, and this is a non-carceral confession because FTP, but I want to just confess to you all that I did not know we were doing presentations. Now, the good news here is that when you have just a few moments to figure out what you're going to say to a crowd of strangers, you really determine what's important to communicate. So I hope you will appreciate the spirit. And I'll say that what I most want to talk about, particularly around our local organizing community, our local movement and building of a truly abolitionist movement, is on the one hand, I want to speak as a member of the Black Philadelphia Radical Collective, which some of you may know formed demands for abolition on behalf of Black Philadelphia. I also want to surface a few moments over the past year that I think in many ways expresses what Gio talks about in this wonderful new book, which I encourage you all to support and read, about the fact that we are already experiencing and building a world without police, right? And at the same time, we are struggling to protect and sustain the moment of struggle that we have experienced in recent times, but is being attacked and in some respects feels like it might be waning. So I want to start with Abolition Summer, and specifically May 30th, 2020, which for those of you who are based in Philly, which I'm assuming we all were, we know that this is the very day that the Philadelphia uprising begins, right? Earlier in the week, many of us watched on our respective, streams or TV channels of choice, we watched a Minneapolis police station go ablaze. And I think for many of us, especially us organizers, something felt different about this moment. And you talk about this in the book. In fact, it opens the book, this realization that something is different when you are watching a police station go up in flames, right? And so many of us who are part of sort of longtime abolitionist Black organizations in the city of Philadelphia, we realized that we needed a local response to be in solidarity with our comrades in Minneapolis, but also to ensure that we are surfacing the ongoing work, right? To dismantle the structures of policing and to build a world, a Black community without police. And so on May 30th, we had our first action, which was at the Philadelphia Art Museum. And a few things were very interesting about this day. How many of you were outside on May 30th, 2020? Well, there was, something that we saw very often over the summer. You announce an action, and then somebody else announces an action before your action. That happened on May 30th, 2020. So we moved from talk about, our action got totally scattered because some people showed up with bullhorns. And I think something that many of us saw over the summer is that anybody with a bullhorn looks like an organizer, right? And so it was a very interesting, took it in a different direction. And so that day, many of us saw the Frank Rizzo statue up in flames. Many of us experienced being kettled by the police. That was the day that, folks in the community, maybe some of us here, made sure we got our new summer wardrobe from Chestnut Street and Walnut. Particularly those of us who came to refer to ourselves as the Black Philadelphia Radical Collective, which I'll describe in a moment, we realized that there was momentum, there was anger, there was a will in the street. We're gassing of 52nd Street, which rolled into a bunch of other bullshit, particularly from City Hall. We realized that we had police. What we mean when we send to share within the community the Black Philadelphia Radical Collective's demands for abolition, which I would like to share with you all, perhaps not for the first time, the work that it did in that moment in reforms as opposed to non-reformist reforms, the conversation. We had folks that were saying we needed body cams. We had folks that were saying we need more Black police officers. We had folks upholding the at the time. And so we on against Black Philadelphians now. And I'm just going to read the preamble and I'll just quickly go through the demands. During this time of rebellion, actionable demands upon this and related state violence endangering our community members are assessment and in our work. We will the wind out of my sails. So say with me, demand one. Immediately remove all symbols of state. They represent immediate steps that we wrote that we recognize that the prison is an extension of police violence and demand the release of our incarcerated family members. Say with me, demand four. Demand four. Immediate and permanent release of all Black political prisoners, including Mumia, Omar Askia, Joseph Jojo Bowen, and all of our Black political prisoners. Say with me, demand five. Demand five. Immediate release of all vulnerable individuals in prison. We also wrote that we demand a complete overhaul of the structures of police accountability. Say with me, demand six. Demand six. A swift firing of killer cops in community response. Demand seven. Say with me, demand seven. Demand seven. Abolish the Fraternal Order of the Police and the Police Advisory Committee. We recognize that the Black community has the right to live safely without the threat of protection for Black Philadelphia. And here we were talking specifically forms. Say with me, demand 10. Demand 10. End all carceral systems. Here we were talking about, of course, mass incarceration, but also the criminalization of race, poverty. Say with me, demand 11. Demand 11. Philadelphia Housing Authority Police. So say with me, demand 12. Demand 12. Fund communities and not cops. I really miss saying those demands. 20 in the summertime in this Hate 5-6, you can see many of our actions. Talking about just a few moments last summer. In fact, within the first month, we have already passed 500 homicides in 2021 in Philadelphia, right? And so in many ways, the question's biggest challenge to abolition in terms of like the street level community building. This is something we talk about in the BPRC. When we talk about abolishing defunding the police, but a 7-year-old boy is murdered in broad daylight while playing on his porch on a block that has 100 children his age, that is a challenge to abolition. It's a challenge. It requires imagination to understand why that is still the solution. So if you went to Simpson Street, which is the street where Zamar Jones lived with his family, Daniel Outlaw, some people's fave, Larry Krasner, not my fave, Larry Krasner showed up, and a host of establishment officials showed up, in part because the police and abolition that was hot in the streets at the time. And so I'm mentioning this in particularly at the community level. But at the same time, we were talking with grieving family members, but also get murdered in the street. What they wanted was healing. And so what we worked together with the community, this is a moment that comes to mind. is October 26th. In the early evening, there was a screening of 40 years junior's fight to free his parents who were incarcerated between August 8th, 1978 and until 2018, along with members of the Move 9. We went from that moment to the precinct at the precinct at 55th and Pine, which is where the officer was dispatched. That how many people were outside that week? Yeah. I won't forget watching members of our community fight back from the police. Literally, I watched one human being carry a full metal fence like this wide and throw it. Is that kind of show of power, that kind of, they didn't need organizers. And so a number of things happened within that murder. Was kidnapped by the police and is up, right? And in addition to that, that first night of the uprising, I'll never forget this. It's like, you know where that McDonald's is on 52nd Street. There's this street sign that says the power of justice. If you weren't there, you probably saw the photos of, right? The cop car on fire. I don't know. So what was fascinating in Nigeria for the past 15 years with youth organizers who, anyway, murder was also happening in Nigeria, which in many ways shows that this is not inherently a transnational question, right? The NSAR's uprising in Nigeria to do similar work in Uganda. They're also being open. Anyway, what I'm pointing out is the transnational prepared to sacrifice us all. So how does that shift our organizing? And I feel like I'm talking too much, so because we had a demand around Citizen Good, former Mayor Wilson as our city's first Black mayor. Years later, after denying any wrongdoing for this, his minions decide that they are going to dedicate a street that we focused on dismantling at the projects in North Philly at 11th and Wallace, where Mumia's incarceration. And streets, people who didn't even know, people learning for the first time about Mumia. And that too is a part. Final call and response was just free Mumia.
With Nikki, with Crystal. To be my face, I see people who have been organizing here for 20 years, doing abolitionists before. This book is decades aftermath, finally late. This book should have been written years ago. It should have been available. Sort of realized that this last year they made possible. So often, U.S. history seems like more constituted to ensure the content or some mentions of police abolition, and there are about 3. Someone on Fox News, the Black Visions Collective in Minneapolis, they said, listen, thinking advanced, the rising. The most important, I believe, is Minneapolis. Philly stands with Minneapolis. It made me immediately think about showed up, and people that were not members of organizations, people that were not on the so-called 5 years later, really exploding. And so I think things are advancing. We're standing, and I like to describe it as a sort of plateau that the rebellions of 2020 have given us. And what it allows us to do is think better and to look further into the future, to look and glimpse more pieces of this abolitionist world and this ecosystem, expanding it. In other words, expanding the world. Part of what I try to argue in the book is that we need to begin by diagnosing the world of the police. In other words, the world that we inhabit. We need to understand that policing is the sort of brutal offspring of a failed reconstruction that taught us many things about what abolition is and what it needs to be. It taught us most specifically that you cannot abolish an institution without rebuilding the world in its wake. Really important sort of 13th Amendment inspired, loopholes. While we got the abolition of slavery, Reconstruction itself as an incredibly inspiring, we're left working on the very same land for some of the very same people that had enslaved them. We got, we got convict leasing, sharecropping, the criminalization of blackness, and the racialization of crime. In other words, we got the world of police, and the police were born, as W.B. Du Bois shows very clearly in Black Reconstruction, directly out of that failure. Sort of abolitionist leading lights have insisted Abolition, therefore, must be understood as a radically. This is the process of Reconstruction, and this is the process that, evoking Angela Davis's own formulation when it comes to prisons, that I speak of in terms of making institutions obsolete. In other words, an institution will only truly disappear once the world has been rebuilt in a way so that that institution millions of private cops. Why? Because our world is built in such a way that it demands the existence of the police, and ultimately until we restructure, rebuild, recreate that world in more liberatory ways, we will still have the police. And this is part of the process I think that we need to think through all of the parameters of it. As others have already pointed out, it's a world that extends far beyond the institution of the police. It involves, police in, taking over schools. It involves police taking over public libraries. It involves them taking over transit spaces. It involves private police expanding dramatically. It involves the expansion of police and police budgets. These things have all been expanding for the past 60 years or more. And precisely what Nikki was pointing to earlier is so essential, because what the police do when they expand is they naturalize their role. They explain and they insist that, and you could be forgiven for thinking that there were always police in public schools because of the way that we assume their existence. There were not police in public schools 60 years ago. This is a new thing. And that's why these struggles are easy and good, powerful leverage points to begin that struggle. That's why the struggle against ICE, which is really not a very old institution at all, is an incredibly important one, and one that opens the way toward a more fundamental struggle against Border Patrol and against the border itself. Policing has been expanding globally, and here policing is synonymous with U.S. imperialism, but also with the way that the U.S. ties foreign aid to the building up of police forces in other countries to disintegrate resistance before it even reaches U.S. shores. It's a process of upholding U.S. colonial domination in the world, and that's why, in part, policing is a global structure, and resistance to it must also be understood as a global phenomenon. There's so much more to be said. I just want to say a couple things about another important piece of the book, which is precisely that if we know, for example, how policing works, what the world of police looks like, if we know expanding space, that these two worlds are locked in a kind of struggle with one another, the fundamental question is about how do we get from here to there. And I think that involves very important attention to being strategic. It involves thinking about what it takes to, on the one hand, fight against the world that we inhabit, and on the other hand, build those alternatives. I think simply building abolitionist alternatives is incredibly crucial to this process, but we must also, for example, target power structures. We must also target the foundations of police power. What are the foundations of police power? The Fraternal Order of Police, organizations that represent the most fascistic elements of police power and have been working for decades to expand it, to make it unquestionable, and to worm their way into the very heart of American society. I mean, and this is, there are many elements of this. Some of the barriers that organizers come up against when they try to transform policing testify to this, right? In Minneapolis, the fact that and for people who maybe weren't paying attention, I think it is an incredible accomplishment that after a full year of counterinsurgency, 44% of residents of Minneapolis voted to dismantle the police. Why? Because the media, the political apparatus, the police chief in Minneapolis illegally electioneering and campaigning against this ballot measure, were all dedicated to convincing people that there is no possibility to think beyond the world of police. Why did this year, interim period even exist? Because the police are written into the charter of the city of Minneapolis, which says that there need to be, by law, a certain number of police per capita. In other words, this is another instantiation of the way that police power writes itself into the very laws of the country, into the founding documents. And so, organizers needed to push, and even the city council needed to push an unelected charter commission to have a ballot measure to reform the charter to make it possible to begin to dismantle the police. That took an entire year, and still it almost passed. I think that's an incredible accomplishment. We need to be open to a whole range, obviously, of different organizing strategies. Again, from the one level of building autonomous power in communities, building self-defense in communities. And here, I'm glad Crystal mentioned self-defense, because a big part of this book is really dedicated to upholding and reasserting the role of self-defense. If you want to talk about community organizing, community power, that community needs to be able to sustain itself, defend itself, and internally keep itself safe. So we need to be thinking about democratic, grassroots ways to organize community safety in a way that doesn't require the police. Again, that makes them obsolete. But it goes all the way from that very local, grassroots level organizing to engaging with the institutions of the state, to engaging with existing, for example, nonprofit organizations that might be contributing to this. It goes all the way up to engaging and pushing back on, for example, city council, transforming laws, the laws that uphold police power, the laws, the so-called law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights that give police special rights, special privileges that prevent them being held responsible, that that give them higher levels of impunity. It means pushing back on, as we're talking about locally with the Fraternal Order of Police, the closed-door negotiations between the city and the FOP, which again, they center on wages and salaries, of course, but the fundamental question of these negotiations is impunity, is making it impossible to hold police accountable. We need to be pushing back on all of those things. We need to be talking seriously about defunding, not the bullshit defunding that Philly claims to have engaged in, where you slide traffic cops over, out of the police budget line and claim that you've cut the budget while expanding and increasing police salaries. No, we need real defunding. And what does real defunding offer in the present? It's precisely the ability to take resources that are community resources. These are resources that are being looted and withdrawn and soaked out of communities. And so they need to be understood as, first of all, belonging to the community. And we're entirely justified. It doesn't make us statists or sort of, whatever else for wanting to demand those resources back. Those are things that need to be taken back, redistributed to communities, and specifically dedicated to intervention programs that work in reducing community violence, that work in making communities safer. We know, and again, we could go into this for hours, but statistically speaking, the police do not make communities safer. That's just true. No matter what kind of hyperventilating happens on Fox News about it, it's simply true. On top of that, what we don't even know is what would happen if we took all of that money back and dedicated it to real responses in communities. You have organizations like Cahoots, which I'm sure people here who have been working on the question of diverting 911 calls away from the police for mental health crises know about. This is an organization that emerged out in Oregon, and immediately on a shoestring budget, a tiny fraction of the police budget reduced police violence to almost zero in the city. Why? Because it's not that expensive. And what we're paying for when we pay for police is a whole range of things that have nothing to do with community safety. And so defunding allows us to take those resources and dedicate them back. It allows us to point toward a community and say, look, $5 million, $10 million, we've reduced the police budget. The community has not gotten any less safe. In fact, it's gotten safer. In fact, now kids have something to do after school. In fact, now when there's a conflict on the block, there are organizations or just community members who can intervene and help de-escalate that conflict and prevent it from becoming violent. These are the kind of struggles. They range all across society, and they need to be built up. This ecosystem needs to be expanded. It's a massive honor to be here with you all to talk more about what that looks like. And what I was saying before the event is just how incredible it is, because I've done some book events where I'm going and I'm talking, and yet to be here in the presence of people who are doing this concretely, who know what it looks like, and who are able to raise in an incredibly concrete way what it would look like to bring these programs of change together. What it would look like to have, for example, an abolitionist platform for the city of Philadelphia that, again, makes demands of the city, that makes demands of communities, and that proposes in a very serious way the abolition of policing, while building this world that is so necessary, the world without police. Thank you.
I think you all can clap a little bit louder than that. So, okay, I want to make sure these mics are hot. That's the hottest one for sure. Are you hot? This is hot. Okay, so I'm going to invite everybody here to let all that just sink in and think about some questions and some comments and like next steps, orientations. But in order to give you all a chance to speak to each other and with each other, maybe I can just sort of pose something that's just a framework that GOU offered us around this plateau that you're saying that is a good way of thinking about how we have arrived after abolition summer to where we are now. And each of you have mentioned in one way or another a presence, an abolitionist presence. And so what I want to ask you to think about is the last part that GOU are offering us here about this sort of dual power that we need to be thinking about. If I can ask you to think about that, the type of presence, the abolitionist presence that you see, you're conjuring, you're participating in, and you're nurturing, that's building autonomous power in communities and also targeting and dismantling the naturalized police power. So both those things at once. I saw a lot of themes in what you're all describing around both of those things, so feel free to ask each other questions about those things or put my whole question aside. I'll leave it to you. And then we're going to turn to everyone else in the room and open up the conversation as well with this microphone.
Could I ask Nikki real quick? I did because I wasn't, involved in the discussions about trying to pressure the city to divert directly 911 calls. And if I understand the way you put it, it's still a question of trying to expand a program that's got its own phone number, which is the problem with all these things, right? And really the crucial point is to get the actual 911 system dedicated to shifting calls to intervention programs, right? Have you seen, because part of the whole problem with policing and the idea of reform is that policing is just this constant cycle of reform. That's all it's been for 100 years. And so it's very interesting to hear you say, well, we're trying to hear it framed that way.
So there's two things. So one way that's like entrenched, when you call the number that you know off the top of your head nationally, that there's going to be a 988 number for that. That's like what won't be police. And so people are thinking that when you call 988, you'll get mobile crisis, and that'll happen like in the next couple of years apparently. So that's to look forward to. But I think we have to figure out a way, entrenchment of the police into like all these systems. I mean, we had like the bullshit like defunding last year of the 19 million, and like they got it all back, y'all. Like they got it back that December, and they got it back this year for last year. They just keep getting their money back. So like, we have to keep fighting these people because they want their hands on all our money. It's ours, and we need to fight for it to get our communities what they need.
I'll just add to that in terms of like the relationship between cops and mental health, particularly around the removal of cops from mental health processes, and particularly you think about the site of University of Pennsylvania, in the sort of like housing crisis that we are, policing apparatus throughout University City, which like metrically is called like the police sort of like exist in that area, was we want to move to a correspondent. And I think about the role that we campaigns and collaboration experiments, and how can we do that authentically and
But also, be involved in your community organization. Be involved.
Who seemed like remotely on this, but I haven't heard presence existing. I don't want to be that person, but at the same time, if no one else is gonna do it, I guess my question is, do y'all have aspirations? My name is Joel Glazer.
Stressed me out, and because whatever it is, Mr. Krasner,
Harm reduction of elects that an objective ability to organize and have seen kind of uplifting of kind of I think we should always be all of that is what I'm really concerned about.
And I live here in those options. And in terms of military
control is a contradicting very different. I think that's useful, right? It's also that when the FOP has gone in our
I met people talk.
I've been really looking like capital and come around as like in some ways be perceived, right? Trying to suppress the ways in which
this question about being shady, But so all I think I want to say, you know, some of those national organizations that kind of want to swoop in. I'll let you say it. You have to be like swoop in because our communities actually need. So go pass the mic.
And out because I'm really fucking pissed off. Actually, this people have sucked dry just the genuine, sincere, like to the point, so that others can talk. You, Chris, and I appreciate what you said, and I feel like we need to go further. Was many of us were out in the streets in late May, early June. I log on Twitter after a night of protests or day of protests, flooding the algorithm. And I'm just like, this is embarrassing as shit. Hustle. We need to talk about the academics, but they're not really a freaking abolitionist. And now everything's to the book title because now it's the sexy thing that is built on people's labor. And you wasn't outside. It'd be one thing if you were outside. If you were in any way tangibly supporting movement work. Well, we've got.
You don't want to be anti-racist, Asante?
You don't want to have an anti-racist grandbaby? So anyway, I'm just so pissed off. Waters down our work. And it support the movement work. Don't even try to be in relationship with the movement. Around like national organizations swooping in. When Walter Wallace Jr. was Breonna Khan, and it's funny because it was a Breonna Khan, you know, not just a Breonna conference, but a Breonna Khan. They tried to do the same thing here. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Was anyone outside? So, you know, just organically people, I don't even know if they were organization, an organizer who I'd never heard of, saw that. I was like, who the fuck goes to the scene of the crime, like without talking to the family? It was absolute. It was, I mean, I believe in the community's right to tell people who not from around here to get the hell on the one, divert, redirect. And it could have been really bad. Next, they find the next ambulance to chase and completely erase the local organizing work that's happening in ways that actually was really hard. And then the last thing I'll say, and this may be just an obvious thing, I'm an organizer with Black Lives Matter Philly. We are one of more than 10 organizations that has publicly, Global Network Foundation now, an entity that has collected in just the past year, they've admitted to $80 million in donations. Who knows about the years before that? And this is all shit I've said before, right? So I'm not first 5 years of existence from the Global Network Foundation. And so for me, like the co-optation piece is real personal because we see this in this moment where our supposed grassroots frontline organizations are becoming like foundations, right? We've already talked about the revolution will not be funded infrastructure that works to diffuse revolutionary movement. And so the co-optation is there. It's happening wherever we are trying to build some radical shit.
Yeah, it's on. Yeah. My name is Jason. Thank you. And I guess the question is, Crystal, I think you started to allude to this, and I think it's been brought up in different ways, not explicitly, but like, how do we have conversations with people that aren't in this space, that aren't strong with a variety of communities, and really hard to get over, I think, in this case? or is this inherently going to be a small movement made up of a small cadre of people that's going to have to push and expand? You know, we're not going to have popular support, in other words. So I'm just curious what you think about that.
So I got the mic. I'll go ahead and share my quick story and pass it. One is to protect the UC townhomes, this public housing complex at 39th and Market, which the developer is now trying to sort of like cash in and sell to create this sort of and displace the mostly sort of like black working class families who live there to build some sort of like high rise, you know, health sciences incubator knowledge thing. And one of the things as we sort of like moved into this campaign is recognizing for us, you know, housing for all is an abolitionist fight, right? While, you know, there are many ways we could talk about just like the industry is real estate as police, you know what I mean, in terms of like who does evictions, right? What the role of police power and sort of, you know, stay in our homes. So when we think about the role of housing for all campaigns in an abolitionist horizon, that's where we're coming in and, you know, engaging with the families and the residents who are already leading that struggle to protect and save their homes. So for us, and kind of like I'm not interested in everyone like trying to claim that I'm an abolitionist, but I do see the power of the many different campaigns that are existing and seeing those as part of a larger abolitionist horizon. And I think in terms of how we do the work that we're doing, it's about that, right? It's like we're building out this mutual aid project, which is investing into abolitionist institution building. You can give us money and think it's just, I'm less interested in the sort of like people claiming an abolitionist identity than I am in us creating abolitionist experiments and practice spaces that are accountable to abolitionist politic. And I think, yes, there's a smaller group of people who will like have to, you know, be responsible for being in integrity to that politic. But in terms of engagement, it's something that we need everyone to be involved in. So how do we create those bridge spaces? So, you know, that's huge. And for everyone, this is my last time to talk, we're having a teach-in on Tuesday, December 15th at the Perlman Quadrangle. If you go to Police Free Pen, you look on our Instagram, you'll see the flyer for it. But it's the Protect the UC Townhomes teach-in. And it's a coalition of organizations that is helping to put it together in solidarity with the residents of the UC Townhomes. And just be on the lookout for that. You can sign our petition. We're continuing to build, continue to organize, and continue to organize.
I'll just say, I mean, there's no pre-established constituency for abolition. I think that's the first thing to say, right? And I think there are a lot of like romantic visions about, I mean, heavily, poor communities of color are radically divided over the question how to relate to the police, right? And this is precisely because of how policing works. It's because, one of the claims is that we are here to protect the most vulnerable, and the contradiction of that claim is those are precisely the same people who are not protected, who are left vulnerable, and who are targeted for greater brutality by a system that excludes and sucks resources out of that community. So that's the fundamental contradiction. And that contradiction, that practical contradiction, of course, yields a contradiction in ideology where people don't trust the police, but also call the police and also think that there's no alternative to the police, in part because there is no alternative in many cases, right? In part because we haven't built those alternatives. And so I think that's the hard work that involves this mass work, that involves this slow work, that involves work that is not necessarily coded as abolitionist work or coded as revolutionary work, that involves building fabric, building relationships, building community, and that's essential. The second piece I think is very interesting what you said. You said, are we gonna be a small minority, right? And I think that's also true, right? And I think it's important to understand that. And it's important to understand that the abolitionists who were fighting for the abolition of slavery were a tiny fringe until the crisis was already full blown, right? And when we talk about the way that policing and prisons naturalize themselves, slavery was naturalized. People could not see beyond the institution of slavery. They thought it would never go away. And it wasn't until the full-blown crisis that abolitionist fanatics helped to unleash that then the vast majority swept toward the side of abolition and swept to it in a mass movement. And so I think the relationship between small, small communities of insurgent, revolutionary fanatics and ideologues is essential in its connection to these mass struggles and these mass movements.
Yeah, I think we like really struggle with the narrative when we're talking to folks in our Black working class communities about this when we are experiencing a violence crisis in the city, and so I think a lot about that, and because defund the police was the demand last summer, but like folks it's scary to folks because people do understand what defund means. They've seen our schools defunded. They've seen everything else defunded. They know what that means. They understand what it means to like have those resources sucked from our communities. And of course you're going to be afraid of when you're experiencing community violence that taking away this one thing that we do have is going to make us less safe. And I think we have to continue to like struggle around making a better narrative and like making the argument to folks that we can create these alternative institutions that'll make us safe.
Maybe just one little thing, which is that I didn't have to explain to my grandfather, who grew up sharecropping, that this system is fucked. We don't have to explain to people who are most affected by police violence that police don't do shit for them, right? And so delinking the spirit of your question from like the actual abolitionist identity or like the naming, the nomenclature, right? We know this shit is fucked, right? And so it's about building with people around the points where we converge, right? It's about bringing more and more and more and more people into this fold until we tear or burn or whatever all of this shit down, while also surfacing and strengthening the work that people are already doing outside of the support that they should have but don't. And it's, not to make it that simple, but it's like kind of that simple.
Oh. Well, I know we're about to close. If I would do anything, I would probably, plug. I think one of the things that we would do that I was privileged to be able to do over 2020 into 2021 was create this anthology through the auspices of the Paul Robeson House Museum, alongside my co-editor, Fajr Muhammad, that was documenting out of the resistance movement. And the reason why we called it How We Stay Free, because we think like in those sustaining those radical imaginations, it's all part of that process that is leading to our liberation. Collective features the folks from Philadelphia Housing Action. We even talk like the historic housing encampment, and all these different instruments of resistance and, to build up, Angela Davis, right? This abolition democracy, right? And building up these institutions. So it's like a shameless Two Common Notions, who has other wonderful titles over here on the table.
We thank you, Chris, and thank you, everybody. We have who matter to us about ideas that we all depend on. So we've got Gio's book, of course, A World Without. So I do encourage you to look through things and pick things up. Our friends at Critical Resistance have dropped off the latest issue of the Abolitionist newspaper, so please pick that up on the way out as well. Also, continue this conversation, and we need your help to do that. So please do talk to us about ideas about how we can move this all forward, because that's what we need to be doing. And there's something else. Umar, for being the abolitionist presence that we wanted to spend some time.